James Maybrick met Florence Chandler, as she was, on board ship coming back from America. He worked in America, and she was then 18, very pretty, lively, Southern American belle, and he was aging, pushing 50, and very aware of his declining years. She was a great catch. He continued with his womanizing, there's no doubt about that, all the time they were married. She refused to sleep with him anymore, and that was the crunch, really. He began to turn against her, and the marriage broke down completely. And by this time, his lifelong habit of taking arsenic and strychnine had really wiped him out.
If the diary is to be believed, James Maybrick's habit of taking arsenic was fueling an already tormented mind.
I cannot live without my medicine. I'm sure I can take more than any person alive.
But how accurate was this portrait of Victorian drug abuse?
The nice thing about the journal, in terms of the way it talks about his use of medicine, first of all, he never actually calls it arsenic in the journal. He always refers to it as his medicine. Arsenic itself was a very mild stimulant, and it was an aphrodisiac. Wasn't really used in the way, for example, say cocaine might be used to get a high there and then, to be used as a major stimulant. And the journal reflects that. The journal doesn't actually have the individual who's writing it using it as a major stimulant in the way, for example, cocaine may be used. It's being used in a much more subtle way, much more akin to the way that arsenic might have been used.
A week after the trial began, James Maybrick's young widow was found guilty of his murder and sentenced to hang. On the surface, the trial of Florence Maybrick would appear to have little in common with the events in Whitechapel, London the previous autumn. But there was no doubt that the diary was supposed to have been written by Florence's husband James. Apart from anything else, the Maybricks' family home in Liverpool was known as Battle Crease.
I believe the Mayricks moved in at the beginning of 1888, and I have the deeds of the house, but of course there's no reference made to them in the deeds because they rented the property. And then following her trial in 1889, the Mayricks moved out again. This in fact was his bedroom, I believe. His bed was over in the corner there, and off this room was his dressing room, and next door to that his study. Well, the electrics have always been a bit of a problem since I moved in, and I decided to have a total rewire, and they fitted a new main to the flat in 1989, I think. And then over a 3-year period I had storage radiators fitted, and I had a ring main installed in the flat.
The floorboards in James Maybrick's study had been lifted for the first time in over a century, just prior to the diary coming to light. According to the Times newspaper, the electricians denied finding anything at the house at this time, although 2 of them did admit to drinking at the same public house as Tony Devereux and Mike Barrett. In Liverpool, the Daily Post newspaper had been the first to become aware of the existence of the Ripper diary, and the closely guarded secret of the author's identity. They too had expected to reveal a hoax.
The first I heard about it was a phone call from a journalist colleague of mine back in April, telling me that on a train journey from Liverpool to London, he had met a man who had the diary of Jack the Ripper. We ran that story in the Daily Post the next day. I thought if somebody's bringing out a book of James Maybrick saying Maybrick is a killer, I thought, well, it's a hoax. It's a hoax.
This piece of scientific apparatus was devised by us in the early stages to try and assess as we were going along what we thought was the likely truth, if you like, about the journal, about the whole affair, the Ripperometer. And as you can see now, it's pointing more towards the truth. I've really been outvoted by my 2 colleagues. I'm still rather sceptical.
My gut instinct, perhaps it's feminine intuition or something, but my gut instinct tells me it's true. It is. We've got the man.
could appear to be a hoax is a pretty incredible tale, isn't it? I got the diary of a man I met in a pub. I mean, who would believe that on the surface? So it's been one-sided. Since the confidentiality agreement has come out, the other side of it is now beginning to be heard. I mean, I've had a chance for the Daily Post to read the diary, and actually I've actually seen it. It's a strange feeling to pick up this old battered ledger and say, well, I wonder if this is true. It's a strange feeling altogether. If it is a hoax, it's the most fantastic piece of work. It doesn't read like a diary at all. In fact, it isn't a diary. It's more like there's no dates to it, there's no names. It doesn't name James Maybrick, it doesn't name the Maybrick family by name at all in it. It drops clues. In fact, if you read it and you didn't know the Maybrick case, you wouldn't know that Maybrick is involved in it. It's a strange hoax if it is a hoax.
We've got a mysterious document which turns up by somebody who takes it in a very amateurish way to the market, apparently coming from a man who's dead and whose family knew nothing whatever about it. Oh dear, oh dear.
And I don't care a damn what anybody says. Everybody is going to come at me and telling me, is it a forgery? Is it this? Is it that? I've got no answers whatsoever. I just don't know.
For some, the uncertain provenance of the journal was already enough to convince them that it had to be a fake. Others were less certain. Far from there being obvious errors in the text, there were many specific references that at least proved the author's attention to detail. For example, today it is accepted that Mary Ann Nichols was the first Ripper victim. At the time of the crimes, however, 2 earlier murders had also been attributed to the same hand. Both Emma Smith and Martha Tabram were popularly believed to have been victims of Jack the Ripper. It wasn't until much later that it became clear that these murders were totally unrelated incidents. This fact alone showed that the journal was either a relatively modern fake or a much older document written by someone whose insight into the crimes went far beyond a superficial general knowledge. Was it even possible that a would-be forger could find a subject who would fulfill all the requirements of a plausible suspect? Could James Maybrick, a successful Liverpool cotton merchant, whose life and death was well documented, step into Jack the Ripper's shoes so easily?
It was in the early hours that Mary Ann Nichols made her way towards Bucks Row in search of 4pence, the price of a bed at her lodging house. At approximately 3:30 a.m., somewhere in or near Osborne Street, she met someone. She must have thought her luck was in. There was a flash of steel, and 2 deep slashes severed her windpipe. Her attacker then turned his attention to her abdomen. Lifting her skirts, he stabbed her vagina and tore at her stomach with a deep, jagged thrust which reached far enough up to cause her bowels to protrude through the wound. Within minutes of the attack, the body was discovered, but her murderer had already slipped back into the shadows, and Whitechapel was about to become a part of British criminal history. Whitechapel, Liverpool, was and still is one of the city's main shopping streets. To the author of the diary, however, it represents something else.
Foolish bitch. I know for certain she's arranged a rendezvous with him in Whitechapel. So be it. My mind is firmly made. London it shall be, and why not? Is it not an ideal location? Whitechapel, Liverpool, Whitechapel, London. Ha ha. No one could possibly place it together.
But the choice of murder sites did not rest solely on the author's desire to play games, as Shirley Harrison discovered.
We knew that his mistress came from, one of his mistresses, he probably had more than one, but in the early years that his mistress came from London. And we tracked her down and we found her, and we traced her story back, and we found that she came to London from Sunderland and she lived in Whitechapel. And we found James living there too in the early years. I think that was the time when I suddenly thought, gosh, this, you know, we really are actually onto something here. This is getting quite exciting.
The public face of James Maybrick was that of a successful businessman and a perfect gentleman. A business colleague spoke of him as one of the straightest and most upright men in a business transaction I have ever known. Another described him as the perfect host. Another remembers him being particularly kind and protective towards his children. But the truth that lay behind the heavy drape of Victorian double standards told a very different story. James Maybrick was a drug addict and an adulterer, and his health was deteriorating as quickly as his marriage. The commonly held belief, however, was that Florence had first met her future lover, Alfred Brierly, in December 1888, too late to provide the suggested motive for murder.
In fact, they met in 87, a whole year before it's generally supposed they met. So by the time the diary begins, which we've worked out to be probably March 88, they were already great friends.
Yet again, the diary had shown itself to be historically accurate, and the possibility remained that we were stepping inside the dark and distorted mind of the real Jack the Ripper for the first time.
I will not allow too much time to pass before my next. Indeed, I need to repeat my pleasure as soon as possible.
Annie Chapman was the Ripper's second known victim, and this time her attacker was determined to get the maximum pleasure from his partner. A strong hand seized her by the throat and sliced into it twice, virtually severing her head. Then, drawing her legs up and pushing her coat and skirt out of the way, he drove his sharp, pointed knife into her stomach. He reached in and lifted the small intestines, placing them above the right shoulder. Again, he used the knife to remove part of the belly wall, including the navel, the womb, the upper part of the vagina, and the greater part of the bladder. Grotesque as this murder was, the writer of the diary had one or two more images to add to the nightmare.
I took some of it away with